There is a passage in the personal journal of James Farnsworth Reed, not the official account he gave to California authorities in the spring of 1847, but the private one his daughter found decades later in a leather satchel beneath the floorboards of their Sacramento home, that was never meant to be read aloud. It consists of only 3 sentences, written in a hand that trembles across the page as though the pen itself recoiled from the words. We found the tracks at dawn, leading north from the last camp. They were fresh, but when we followed them past a ridge, they simply stopped, as if whoever made them had been lifted straight out of the snow. Reed crossed out the passage with such force that the nib tore through the paper. Below it, in smaller script, he wrote only, "No good can come from speaking of this." The Donner Party's ordeal has been documented with the grim thoroughness reserved for tragedies that force a nation to examine its own mythology. We know the dates, the delays, the terrible choices made in the high Sierra winter. But there are details that exist only in the margins of those records, impressions that the survivors refused to clarify, silences that lengthened when certain questions were asked. Among the rescuers who climbed into those mountains in February and March of 1847, there circulated stories that never found their way into newspapers or official reports. Stories about things seen at the edge of campfire light, about the way certain members of the trap party would stop mid-sentence and turn toward the trees, listening to something the rescuers could not hear, and stories about tracks. This is not the well-known history of the Donner Party. This is about what happened in the 5 days following the arrival of the first relief, when 7 men climbed back down through Donner Pass with 23 survivors and began to notice that they were being followed by something that left footprints in the snow but cast no shadow in the morning light. The winter of 1846 to 1847 was the worst the Sierra Nevada had seen in living memory, according to the Washoe people who inhabited those mountains and who knew enough to move to lower ground when the autumn storms began too early. By November, the passes were choked with snow that would eventually reach depths of 20 feet in the drifts. The Donner Party, 87 immigrants bound for California, found themselves trapped on the eastern side of the range, scattered between 2 camps nearly 6 miles apart. They had been delayed by poor decisions and bad counsel. The Hastings cutoff, the untested route they had followed to the Wasatch Mountains and across the salt flats of Utah, had cost them precious weeks. By the time they approached the Sierra in late October, they were exhausted, low on provisions, and caught completely unprepared when the snow began to fall and did not stop. The larger group made camp near what is now Donner Lake, constructing rough cabins from timber and canvas. A smaller group, including George and Tamsen Donner, camped several miles back near Alder Creek after George injured his hand. Between them lay only a narrow trail through dense forest and steep terrain, a trail that would become increasingly difficult to navigate as the snow deepened and the temperature dropped. What followed is well documented. Starvation, death, and eventually the unspeakable decisions that survival demanded. Several attempts were made to cross the pass on foot, and a group known as the Forlorn Hope managed a breakthrough in December, though only 7 of the 17 who started reached the Sacramento Valley alive. Their reports prompted the organization of rescue parties. The first relief, led by Aquila Glover and Reason Tucker, reached the lake camp on February 18, 1847. They found a settlement that barely resembled a human habitation. The cabins were half buried in snow, accessible only through tunnels. The survivors who emerged were skeletal, hollow-eyed, speaking in voices that seemed to come from very far away. Some could not stand. Others stood but would not meet the eyes of their rescuers. Glover and Tucker brought what supplies they could carry and made the difficult decision about who was strong enough to attempt the journey back. 23 people, mostly women and children, were selected. The rescuers distributed what food remained, promised to send more help, and on February 22nd began the descent with their charges, retracing the route they had carved up through the snow only days before. The return journey should have taken 4 days at most. They were following their own trail, and though the survivors were weak, the rescuers were experienced men who knew mountains and winter travel. The weather had cleared. Visibility was good. It took them 9 days. And in the journal entries, letters, and depositions that survive from those 9 days, there appears, again and again, in the careful language of men, trying to describe something they do not fully believe themselves, a recurring detail that none of them could adequately explain. The tracks. The first mention appears in a letter written by Reason Tucker to his brother in Missouri, dated April 3rd, 1847. Tucker was not a man given to imagination. He had worked as a trapper and guide throughout the Rockies, and had spent enough winters in the wilderness to understand its dangers without embellishing them. His letter is businesslike for the most part, describing conditions, supplies, and the state of the survivors. But near the end, he includes a paragraph that feels oddly separate from the rest, as though written later and with reluctance. On the second night, descending from the pass, we made camp in a clearing perhaps 2 miles below the summit. The snow was still deep, and we dug out a space of fire and arranged the people as best we could for warmth. John Rhodes, who had taken the last watch before dawn, woke me earlier than expected. He did not speak at first, only gestured toward the tree line to the north. In the blue light before sunrise, I could see what had troubled him. A line of tracks emerging from the forest, approaching to within perhaps 30 feet of our camp, then circling around us at that fixed distance before disappearing back into the trees on the southern side. They were human tracks, or nearly so, barefoot, from the look of them, though I cannot fathom how anyone could walk barefoot through snow at that temperature and live. Rhodes asked if I thought someone from the lake camp had followed us. I told him it was possible, though I could not think why they would approach so closely and then retreat without calling out. We did not mention it to the survivors. There seemed no purpose in adding to their fear. The same incident is referenced in the diary of Aquila Glover, though his description is briefer and more careful. Tracks observed near camp. Origin unclear. Likely a straggler from the party. Delirious. We'll watch tonight. But they were not being followed by a straggler. Every member of the rescue party was accounted for. The survivors, gaunt, frostbitten, barely able to walk, were clustered together near the fire and had been throughout the night. The tracks came from outside the camp, from the forest itself, and they followed a pattern that would repeat itself night after night for the remainder of the journey. Always at night, always circling at a fixed distance, always barefoot. By the third night, all 7 rescuers had seen them. William Eddy, one of the survivors making the descent and himself a former member of the Forlorn Hope, later testified in a deposition related to relief funding that the rescuers began to behave strangely after the second day. He described them as watchful in a way that had nothing to do with the trail, and noted that they kept the group moving faster than the weakened survivors could comfortably manage. When Eddy asked Glover why they were pushing so hard, Glover told him only that they needed to reach lower elevations quickly before the weather turned. But the weather did not turn. The skies remained clear, cold, and full of stars. On the 4th night, they camped in a narrow ravine where the snow was shallower and the trees grew close on both sides. It was Eddy who first noticed the sound. He describes in his deposition as a sliding, scraping noise, like something heavy being dragged across snow, but rhythmic, almost like footsteps, though not quite matching any gait I knew. The sound circled the camp just beyond the firelight for what he estimated was an hour. The rescuers sat with their rifles across their knees, facing outward, saying nothing. None of them went to investigate. When Eddy asked what they were waiting for, Reason Tucker told him quietly to keep his voice down and to make sure the children stayed near the fire. Eddy writes, "I have seen men face grizzlies and hostile tribes without that look in their eyes. This was different. They were not preparing to fight. They were trying not to be noticed." The tracks appeared again at dawn, traced in a wide loop around the campsite. This time, several of the survivors saw them. Levi and Aunt Murphy, traveled with her grandchildren, asked Tucker directly what had made them. Tucker said he did not know. When she pressed him, he said only that they needed to keep moving, and that questions could wait until they reached the valley. But Levi and Aunt Murphy was not a woman easily dismissed. She had survived the winter at the lake camp, had watched members of her family die, and had made decisions that she would carry silently for the rest of her life. She understood when men were lying out of kindness, and she understood when they were lying out of fear. In a letter she wrote to her sister 2 years later, one of the last letters she ever wrote before her death, she described what she saw that morning. The prints were the size of a man's foot, but the stride was wrong, too long, and they sank deep into the snow, as though whatever made them was far heavier than it appeared. I followed them with my eyes as far as I could see, up to the edge of the tree line. They did not wander or stumble. They moved with purpose. And at one point, where they came closest to our camp, they stopped. There were 2 prints side by side, facing inward, as if something had stood there for a long time, watching us sleep. One of the children, a girl of 9 named Mary Graves, later told her daughter that she had seen something that night, though she had not spoken of it at the time because she thought she was dreaming. She said she woke in the darkness and saw a figure standing just beyond the fire's reach, tall and thin, motionless. She thought at first it was one of the rescuers keeping watch. But the figure did not move the way a man moves. It stood too still, she said, and when she blinked it was gone, not walking away, but simply absent, as though it had never been there. Her daughter, recording this memory in 1891, noted, "My mother would not say more, except that she was certain it had been watching her, and that she had felt, even as a child, that it was waiting for something." The rescuers began to disagree among themselves about the route. According to a letter from John Rhodes to his family in Illinois, Aquila Glover wanted to push straight down the main trail, moving as quickly as possible and stopping only when absolutely necessary. Reason Tucker argued for a slower pace, worried that the weaker survivors would not be able to keep up and that they risked losing people to exhaustion or exposure. But there was another reason, Rhodes suggests, though he does not state outright. Tucker believed that moving faster made us more noticeable. I did not understand what he meant at the time, but I did not question him either. He had a way of looking back over his shoulder at the trail behind us that made it clear he was expecting something to be there. On the 5th night, they did not light a large fire. This decision is difficult to explain from a survival standpoint. The temperature was still well below freezing. The survivors needed warmth, and firelight was their only protection against the darkness. But Glover gave the order to build only a small, low fire, banked with stones to diffuse the light. When one of the survivors protested, Glover told him to be quiet. Eddie's deposition records the event as follows. "We sat in near darkness, huddled together, and listened. The sound came again, closer this time, on both sides of the camp. Not one source, but 2, moving in parallel. Tucker whispered that no one was to leave the group for any reason. One of the children began to cry, and her mother covered her mouth, not cruelly, but urgently, as though sound itself were a danger. The night passed in silence. When dawn came, the tracks were everywhere, circling the camp, crisscrossing each other, approaching to within 10 feet of where the group had slept. In one place, near the edge of the firelight, there was a single handprint pressed into the snow. It was the size of a man's hand, but the fingers were too long and there was no thumb. Glover ordered the group to move immediately. They did not stop to eat. They reached a place on the 6th day that no longer appears on modern maps, though it is mentioned in several of the survivor accounts. It was a depression in the landscape, surrounded on 3 sides by steep slopes and accessible only through a narrow gap in the rocks. The snow there was oddly shallow, barely a foot deep, when all around it remained waist-high. The trees grew in strange formations, twisted and leaning away from the center of the depression, as though bent by some persistent wind, though there was no wind. Glover did not want to stop there. He argued for pressing on, even though the light was fading and survivors were exhausted. Tucker overruled him. They needed rest, he said, and the shallow snow made it the most practical campsite they had encountered in days. But William Eddy, listening to the exchange, noted that Tucker seemed uncertain, that he looked around the depression with an expression that Eddy described as the look of a man who has walked into a room and found it unexpectedly occupied. They made camp as the sun dropped behind the ridge. The fire was built in the center of the depression, and the group arranged themselves around it in a tight circle. The rescuers positioned themselves on the outside, facing outward. No one spoke. The silence in that place was profound, not the peaceful silence of a winter forest, but an absence of sound that felt deliberate, as though the wind and the distant creaking of trees had been carefully removed. It was Levi and Aunt Murphy who first said aloud what some of them had been thinking. Something is wrong with this place. Tucker told her to rest. She shook her head. The snow, she said. Why is the snow so shallow here? And where are the animal tracks? We have seen deer and foxes every day since we left the pass. There is nothing here, not even birds. One of the rescuers, a man named Daniel Rhodes, John's brother, stood and walked slowly around the perimeter of the depression, studying the ground. When he returned, his face was pale. There are tracks, he said quietly, all around us. But they do not come in, and they do not leave. They just circle. Eddie writes that the temperature seemed to drop as the darkness deepened, though the fire was strong and well-fed. The cold became physical, pressing against them, and several of the children began to shiver violently despite being wrapped in blankets. One of the women, Eddie does not record her name, began to pray aloud, and Tucker told her gently to stop. Do not draw attention, he said. Attention from what? She asked. Tucker did not answer. The sound began just after full dark. It was not the dragging, scraping noise they had heard before. This was different, a low, rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming against wood, coming from multiple directions at once. Slow at first, then faster, then stopping abruptly, replaced by something that might have been breathing, though it was too loud and too slow to be human. Mary Graves, the child who had seen the figure by the fire, began to scream. Her mother covered her mouth, but the girl fought free and pointed toward the gap in the rocks, the only entrance to the depression. There was something standing there. All of them saw it. The descriptions vary slightly, as descriptions of traumatic events always do, but the consistencies are striking. It was tall, far taller than a man. It stood upright, but its proportions were wrong in ways that none of them could articulate clearly. Glover, in his diary, writes only, it was shaped like a man the way a shadow is shaped like a man, recognizable but not right. Tucker's letter is more detailed, though his language is hesitant, as though he is struggling to find words for something that resists description. It did not move the way living things move. It stood at the entrance of the depression, and though there was no moon, I could see it clearly, or I could see the absence of it, the space it occupied. It had no face that I could discern, but I felt with absolute certainty that it was looking at us. Not at the group, but at each of us individually, one after another, as though it were selecting. One of the men raised his rifle. Tucker pushed the barrel down and shook his head. They sat frozen, barely breathing, while the figure stood motionless at the gap. Minutes passed. Then, without sound or movement, it was simply gone, not retreating, but vanishing, as though it stepped sideways out of the world. The tapping sound resumed, fainter now, receding into the trees. No one slept that night. They kept the fire burning high and sat pressed together, the rescuers with their weapons ready, the survivors silent and wide-eyed. Eddie recorded that Glover prayed quietly in a language he did not recognize. Something old, he thought, that Glover must have learned from trappers or native guides. When dawn finally came, they left the depression without speaking and did not look back. They reached the lower settlements on March 3rd, 5 days later than expected. The survivors were taken in, fed, and given medical care. The rescuers gave their reports to the authorities in Sutter's Fort and the small settlement at Johnson's Ranch. Those reports were thorough regarding the condition of the remaining party members still trapped in the mountains, the supplies needed, and the routes that were passable. They did not mention the tracks. When the second relief, led by James Reed, ascended into the mountains a week later, they followed the trail marked by the first relief. Reed's journal makes note of the campsite in the depression and records a strange detail. The trees surrounding this place are scarred, as though something with great strength has clawed at the bark. Glover made no mention of this in his report. I wonder what else he did not mention. Reed's party found additional survivors and brought them down without incident. The third and fourth relief efforts, mounted in March and April, completed the evacuation. By the time the snow melted, 42 members of the original Donner Party had died. The survivors scattered, most of them moving on to other parts of California or returning east. Very few ever spoke publicly about their experiences in detail, but in private letters, in journal entries that were not meant for publication, in testimony given years later when memory had softened the edges of trauma, there are fragments. Levi Na Murphy never returned to the Sierra Nevada. In her final letter to her sister, she wrote, "I cannot explain what we saw, and I will not try, but I know that we were fortunate to leave those mountains. I do not believe everyone did." William Eddy, who had lost his wife and children during the winter and who carried that grief for the rest of his life, testified in 1850 during a legal proceeding related to the relief parties. The transcript includes a strange exchange. When asked why the first relief took longer than expected to return, Eddy paused for a long time before answering. "We were delayed," he said. "By what?" the attorney asked. "By the route," Eddy said. "The route was difficult. But you were following the same trail you had ascended. Was it not simply a matter of retracing your steps?" Eddy looked at the attorney for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "We tried to, but the trail kept changing." The attorney did not pursue the question. Reason Tucker returned to trapping in the Rockies and never guided another relief effort. In a letter to his brother written in 1852, he mentioned the Donner Rescue only once. "I have been in the mountains all my life, and I know the things that live there. I know the animals, the weather, the dangers a man can prepare for. But there are places where the mountains are not empty, and a wise man does not linger in those places. We should not have stopped in that depression. We should have kept walking." Aquila Glover sold his property in California in 1849 and moved to Oregon. He never wrote about the rescue in detail, though his daughter later reported that he kept a journal that he burned shortly before his death. She asked him why, and he told her, "Something should not be remembered too clearly." The depression where the first relief spent the sixth night was noted on early maps of the region as Shoshone Hollow, though no local tribes claimed a name or acknowledged familiarity with the place. By the 1860s, it had disappeared from official surveys. Modern hikers and historians have attempted to locate it based on the survivor accounts, but the descriptions are vague and the landscape has changed. Some believe it was buried in a rock slide. Others think the coordinates were simply recorded incorrectly. There is one final document worth noting. In 1897, 50 years after the rescue, a man named Thomas Broderick, who had been 5 years old during the descent with the first relief, gave an interview to a Sacramento newspaper. He remembered very little of the journey, he said, except for one night when everyone had been frightened and no one would explain why. But he remembered something else, a detail that had stayed with him. "There was a man," he said, "who walked with us for part of the way. I saw him on several mornings, just at dawn, walking parallel to our group, but never coming close. He was very tall and walked strangely, with long steps. I thought he might be an Indian guide, but when I asked my mother, she told me there was no one there. She told me not to look at him. I asked why, and she said, because if you look at him too long, he might look back." The interviewer asked Broderick if he thought he had imagined the figure. Broderick said no. He said he had seen the figure's tracks in the snow. And he said that years later, when he was a grown man working in the Sierra foothills, he had seen those tracks again, crossing a trail near Emigrant Gap, disappearing into the trees. He never followed them. The Donner Party remains one of the most studied tragedies in American history. Historians have examined every decision, every delay, every circumstance that led to disaster. We know the names of the dead. We know what the survivors endured. We know the cost of ambition and poor planning and the limits of human endurance. But there are margins in every history, places where the record grows quiet, where the details do not quite align, where the people who either choose their words carefully or choose not to speak at all. The tracks are one of those margins. They appear in enough accounts, described with enough consistency, that they cannot be easily dismissed as hallucination or folklore. The men who saw them were experienced frontiersmen, not prone to panic or superstition. The survivors who mentioned them were people who had already endured horrors that would have broken most minds. They had no need to invent new ones. And yet the tracks exist only in fragments, in letters that were filed away and forgotten, in journals that were never published, in testimonies that were recorded and then quietly ignored. Perhaps the rescuers believed that acknowledging what they had seen would cast doubt on the rest of their account. Perhaps they feared that speaking too clearly about the tracks would make them seem unreliable, and that the plight of those still trapped in the mountains would be taken less seriously. Or perhaps they simply understood, as Tucker suggested, that there are things a wise man does not linger on. The mountains are still there. The past still carries the name of the family that did not survive it. And on certain winter nights, when the snow is deep and the sky is clear, there are hikers and rangers who report seeing tracks that do not match any known animal. Tracks that circle their camps at a fixed distance, that appear at dawn and lead nowhere, that stop abruptly as though the thing that made them simply stepped out of the world. They do not follow those tracks. They pack up quickly and move to lower ground. And if you ask them why, they will tell you the same thing the rescuers of the first relief might have said if they had been willing to answer honestly. Because some trails are not meant to be followed, and some things that walk in the high mountains walk there still, patient and enduring, waiting at the edges of human passage for reasons we will never fully understand. James Farnsworth Reed tore that passage from his journal, the one about the tracks that led to nothing, but his daughter found it, and she kept it pressed between the pages of a family Bible, along with a note in her own hand that read, "My father would not speak of this. When I asked, he would only say that there are older things in history in these mountains, and that we are guests in their country, whether we know it or not." The last recorded sighting of the tracks was in the winter of 1983 by a backcountry ranger named Samuel Cortez, who was checking snow conditions near the old emigrant trails. He photographed them, measured them, and filed a report that was later dismissed as inconclusive. The photographs show a line of prints in fresh snow, barefoot and impossibly deep, circling a frozen lake at dawn. In the margin of his report, Cortez wrote a single line that was later crossed out by his supervisor. They were still warm.